All right. Hey, everyone. Sorry about my camera movement. My cat is currently bumping my webcam. Thank you all for being here. This is the second in our Manta Tech Series. Last week, we talked about consensus with Adam, and today we're talking about zero knowledge proofs and ZK SNARKs with Todd. And without further ado, Todd, would love to hear a brief intro and get right into it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kenny. And thanks to everybody for showing up. My name is Todd. I'm a cryptographer with the Manta Network. Before this, I was a mathematician. So I did a math PhD and then was just really interested in Web3 and what could be done with math. And it turns out that zero knowledge proof is one of the coolest things you can do with it. However, don't be afraid. I will be giving this introduction assuming no math background whatsoever. So if you're curious and you listen, then I suspect you will understand. So the talk is going to be about SNARKs, ZKPs, and other things the NSA doesn't want you to know about. The goal, oh, I need to share my screen, don't I, Kenny? Sorry, I'm not doing that yet. Let's see, this one. How's that? Excellent. So SNARKs, ZKPs, and other things the NSA doesn't want you to know about. The goal for this talk is to explain what is a ZK SNARK, at least in approximate terms, and what can we use them for. So specifically, what do we use them for here at Manta? Now, a ZK SNARK is, that's an acronym. So let's start by talking about what it stands for. The Z stands for, well, the ZK stands for zero knowledge. The S is for succinct. The N is non-interactive. And the ARK is argument of knowledge. So it's a zero knowledge, succinct, non-interactive argument of knowledge. Now that's a pretty difficult mouthful right there. And it probably doesn't tell you very much about what a ZK SNARK is. So now, maybe your first instinct would be to look in the literature and see what they say about ZK SNARKs. If you do that, you're probably going to find something a little bit like this. You might find a really unhelpful and unapproachable jumble of formulas. And what we're going to do today is ignore all of that and try to get at least the idea of a ZK SNARK out just using a nice little story. So I have a story that I'm going to tell you. I think it will illustrate what a ZK SNARK is. It doesn't take a long time to tell. This presentation is actually pretty short, so I'll be leaving plenty of time for questions, and I ask that you just type them into the Ask a Question entry, and we can deal with them at the end. So here's the story. This happened during COVID, during the lockdowns. We all went a little bit crazy, myself included. And what happened for me was I found this Rubik's Cube in my home, right? And I remembered when I was a kid that I really wanted to learn how to solve the Rubik's Cube. I thought it was so cool. And I actually couldn't do it. I never figured it out. So what happened was that I picked up this Rubik's Cube in my house and I just sort of started messing with it a little bit, trying to solve it. And it became an obsession for me. I was spending like hours a day trying to solve the cube, couldn't figure anything out, wasn't getting any work done anymore. And so I said, wow, this is a real problem. I have to go and I have to figure out how to solve this cube. And the best way to do it is if I hire someone to teach me how to solve the cube. So I was looking for something rather unusual, a Rubik's Cube tutor, right? And what I did was, you know, what anyone does when they're looking for something unusual. I went online and I posted an ad. So I posted an ad. I said, I'm looking for a Rubik's Cube tutor. I will pay $100 to anybody who can teach me how to solve the cube. And within a few minutes, I had an inbox full of replies from people who said, sure, I'll teach you how to solve it. So I picked the best looking one. And as I said, this was back in the days of COVID lockdowns. So we weren't able to meet up in person. And what we had to do was a Zoom session for the tutoring. So they said, okay, I'm going to need the payment up front before we start the tutoring session. And I perhaps was a bit naive, and I said, yeah, that's okay. So I transferred them $100, and we opened our Zoom meeting and we started it. And I got scammed. Okay, they had no idea how to solve a Rubik's Cube, right? So that's my own fault, right? That's my own fault. I never should have sent somebody that $100 without being sure that they know how to solve the Rubik's Cube, right? So I was like, okay, this is still very important to me to learn how to solve it. So I am going to keep searching for a tutor. But now, before I pay somebody, I ought to make sure that they actually know how to solve the Rubik's Cube, right? The issue is that we don't have any government body for regulating Rubik's Cube tutors, right? We don't have any certificates that are awarded by universities for skill in Rubik's Cube solving. So I had to come up with a way of verifying that they know how to solve the Rubik's Cube that was entirely new, right? Entirely my own. So why don't we start introducing a little bit of terminology that will come up when you talk about zero-knowledge proofs and is useful to the rest of this story. What I wanted was, I wanted to come up with a way for people to convince me that they can solve the Rubik's Cube. And this is a thing that every ZK SNARK has. It has some statement that needs to be proven. In this case, the statement is, I can solve the Rubik's Cube. The other thing that ZK SNARKs have is they have two parties, prover and verifier. The prover is always someone who's trying to prove the statement. So in this case, it's a Rubik's Cube tutor who wants to convince me that they can solve the Rubik's Cube. And the verifier would be me. That would be the person who's trying to be convinced or to check whether the proof is convincing, right? And then there's also a protocol. And a protocol is just some sequence of steps that the prover uses to create their proof, and a sequence of steps that the verifier uses to check that proof and decide whether or not it's valid. Okay, so I just bring up that vocabulary because anytime you hear about ZK SNARKs, these four components are always there. There's always a statement, prover, verifier, and a protocol. So right, getting back to the Rubik's Cube example, I'll give you two examples of bad protocols. Okay, so the first one I came up with, I said, I changed my ad online. I said, I will hire a Rubik's Cube tutor for $100. However, before I pay you, you have got to send me a video of you shuffling a Rubik's Cube, then solving that Rubik's Cube. And if I watch the video and it's legitimate, then we can go ahead and have our tutoring session, right? I'll pay you the $100 and we can have our tutoring session. So that's an example of a protocol, right? This protocol is the prover should film themselves shuffling and then solving a Rubik's Cube and send that video to me. So that video becomes the proof. And then the verification protocol is I watch the video and I decide whether or not the video seems legit. So I thought that this was a pretty good protocol. However, I got an email from someone. He said, I would like to be your Rubik's Cube tutor. However, I can't send you that proof because what if you watch the video and you learn from my video how to solve the cube, right? If somebody sends me a video of themselves shuffling the cube and then solving it, then just by watching their video, maybe I'm going to already learn some valuable techniques about how to solve the cube. Maybe I could even learn entirely how to solve it just from watching that video. And he has a really good point, right? If you're the tutor who's trying to sell your knowledge, then the proof that you have that knowledge, it shouldn't reveal the knowledge that you have to sell, right? Because if I've already gotten some of that knowledge, why would I pay you for it, right? So that was a very good point. And that points out a flaw with that protocol, which is that the proofs leak a lot of the knowledge. So they don't have what we would call the zero knowledge property. So I said to the guy I replied, I said, okay, what would you suggest, right? How could you prove to me that you know how to solve the cube without revealing too much information about how you do it? What he said was, what I'm going to do is shuffle a cube for you on camera, but then I'm going to move my hands out of frame while I solve it, okay? And then I'll show you the finished cube. And then you can see that I know how to do it, but you won't get to see me solving it. I said, okay, that seems legit. So he sent me such a video. I watched it. It seemed fine to me. And I sent him $100 and we started our tutoring session. Unfortunately, I got scammed again. This guy also had no idea how to actually solve a Rubik's Cube. I thought about it a little bit, and I think that what must have happened is that he shuffled his cube on camera, and then when he moved it out of frame, I bet that he replaced it with a cube that was already solved, and then just showed me that, right? So the issue is that although this proof was zero knowledge, it was not convincing, actually, or it shouldn't have been convincing. I was rather foolish to be convinced by it. And this kind of demonstrates a fundamental tension that we have when we talk about proofs or arguments of knowledge, which is to be really convincing, the argument had to give away a lot of information, right? The really convincing argument was a video of him solving the cube from start to finish, but that gave away too much information. The other extreme was his solution, which gave away no information, but was actually not convincing, right? Or shouldn't have been convincing to me. So that's the dilemma that we have, right? That's what we're up against, is we have to try to come up with a protocol where the proof is zero knowledge, meaning that I'm not going to learn anything about solving a Rubik's Cube by watching the proof or looking at the proof. But the proof is also convincing, meaning a person who can't solve the Rubik's Cube would never be able to create such a proof. That's what convincing would mean in this case, right? And that's a more difficult thing to come up with. And for a long time, I was worried that I would just never learn how to solve the cube, because I thought this is an unsolvable problem, and I'm just going to keep getting scammed. Until one day, it occurred to me that there is a way that we can do this. I was thinking about what it means to be a true master of the cube. And a true master of the cube, it occurred to me, this was the key realization. A true master of the cube is not just someone who can take a shuffled cube and solve it in the classical sense, where one side is green and one side is blue and one side's red, right? A true master of the cube could do that, or they could put a cube into any valid configuration of the Rubik's Cube, right? So not just taking it, shuffling it, putting it in the classical solution, but rather taking any configuration that I specify and putting their cube into that configuration, right? So with that realization, I came up with a new protocol. Here's the new protocol. I start by shuffling my cube and taking pictures of all 6 sides of my cube. And I post those pictures in my ad as a challenge. And I say, here's the challenge. You must put your cube into this exact configuration. If you can send me a picture of your cube that's in this exact configuration, then I will pay you $100 to teach me how to solve the cube, right? So in that protocol, there's a challenge, which is pictures of my shuffled cube. There's a proof, which is pictures of their cube in the same configuration as mine. And then there's the verification procedure, which is me just checking that their picture really does match my picture. And this ought to be convincing, because if you think about how many possible configurations I could have come up with when I shuffled the cube, it's something like a billion. There's like a billion different cubes that you can make by shuffling the cube, different configurations you can make by shuffling the cube. So the chances of a person who doesn't know how to solve the cube chances of that person being able to put their cube into my shuffled configuration are just exceedingly low, because there are so many possible configurations out there that you would never end up at the same one as me just by random luck, right? If you got your cube into my configuration, it must be because you really know how the cube works. So I said, okay, this is my last try. All right, I will post this ad online. I will try it one more time, and if this doesn't work, then I'm giving up, because at this point I had already lost $200 to scammers. Luckily this time it actually worked, right? So I got very, very few replies that time, because I admit that what I just came up with, it is harder than what we typically call solving the cube, right? Moving it between any configuration to any other, it is a harder problem than solving the cube. But if you want to be my tutor and earn $100 for tutoring me, then maybe it's reasonable for me to demand that you have that level of cube mastery. And sure enough, I did find an excellent tutor, and they taught me everything I needed to know, and now I can solve Rubik's cubes, right? So that is just a silly little story. Of course, it's not true, but it's a silly little story that's meant to illustrate a bit about zero knowledge proofs and as well, specifically ZK SNARKs. So what I described is almost a ZK SNARK for the Rubik's Cube tutoring problem. But of course, that's not a real problem. So why don't we start now thinking a little bit more about real problems, right, that we might actually have on a blockchain. So what would be the requirements of a SNARK that we might want to use on a blockchain? What kind of protocol would actually be useful for us if we were no longer in the silly made-up realm of Rubik's Cube tutoring, but we were instead trying to come up with something useful, right? I would say that the first obvious requirement is succinctness. Now, what succinctness means is roughly that the proof should be small and the verification of the proof should be quick. So in my example, the proof was pictures of a Rubik's Cube that's in my chosen configuration. I would say that that's reasonably small, right? It's a few pictures. That's a small amount of data. And the verification time, it's also pretty short. I have to just check, each square is right. And, maybe I'm quick at doing that. So I think we could call that a succinct protocol. You can see why succinctness is necessary for a blockchain transit application, because the proof is going to be submitted to the chain, right? And it's expensive to put data on chain. So we want the proof to be as small as it can be, so that we have to put as little data as possible on chain. And we want the verification time to be fast, because it's the chain itself that has to do these verifications, right? And if the verification is very costly, then this is going to either take a long time or cost a lot in gas fees or what have you. But you can see that both forms of succinctness are rather important for a blockchain ZK SNARK. That's the first point. The other would be non-interactivity. I mentioned that the N in SNARK stood for non-interactive. And let's first explain what interactive is. So my proof is actually not a SNARK because it is interactive. It's interactive because it started with me sending this challenge out to the world, right? When I took pictures of my shuffled cube, I sent a message to the world, which was the challenge, and then they sent a message back to me, which was their proof. Because messages went in both directions, we say that that's an interactive proving scheme. And you don't want that for a blockchain, because in the blockchain situation, the verifier is not going to be a person like me. It's going to be a blockchain, right? And so we're only supposed to send messages to blockchains. We're only supposed to post data to blockchains. We're not supposed to wait for blockchains to send us messages, right? So if we want to come up with a scheme where the verifier can be a blockchain, then we need that scheme to be non-interactive. So that's the one imperfection in the example that I gave you, is that it's interactive. And we could think a little bit more about how to make it non-interactive, but our time is probably better spent moving on to the actual things that happen in blockchain, in zero-knowledge blockchain applications. So the kinds of statements that you'd be interested in for an on-chain application, I've just given a few examples. You might be interested in proving the statement, I am the owner of some token, let's say 1 ETH, right? Or you might need to prove, I am a member of some community, like some DAO, or I am a citizen of some country, or I'm a graduate of some university, right? Something like that. Or in a rather different direction, you might want to prove a statement like, I have verified a batch of transactions. So that statement is sort of the first step on the road towards ZK rollups, right? Where instead of having the chain verify a bunch of transactions, some party verifies those transactions off chain, produces a ZK SNARK proof that they did the verification honestly and successfully, and then just puts that proof on chain, right? So that the chain is now verifying proofs instead of verifying transactions. That's a super simplified version of ZK rollups, right? I won't go any further into that because that's not what we do at Manta Network. I'd like to talk more about one of the things that we actually do, which is private payment protocols, right? So that's what MantaPay allows you to do, is private payment. Now, by private payment, I mean that we should be able to send tokens using a blockchain, but in such a way that the sender address, the receiver address, the token type, and the token amount are all private, meaning that people looking at the blockchain, at the public ledger, will not be able to determine those 4 sensitive pieces of information just from looking at the transaction that's on chain. So how can we do that? I'm going to just give a very, it's sort of a cartoon of what a private payment protocol actually looks like. It's more complicated than this, but you can understand most of what goes on just by thinking about this. All right, so here's what we have. We have a really large bucket, okay? And this bucket is full of little pieces of paper. Each one of those pieces of paper is what we call a UTXO. It's a term that you're probably familiar with. It stands for unspent transaction output. And what it means is that it specifies an asset, like 1 ETH, for example, and an owner, like me. What's different, though, about this bucket of UTXOs as compared to, let's say, the bucket of Bitcoin UTXOs, what's different about this one is that every UTXO is encrypted. So if you looked at the bucket of Bitcoin UTXOs, you would be able to see what is the asset amount and who is the owner, or at least what is the the public address of the owner. But with a private payment protocol, you would not be able to determine that. You would pick up a piece of paper, it would be encrypted, and unless you're the owner, you would not know the keys to decrypt it. And so you would not be able to get very much information, or any information really, out of one of these UTXOs. Okay, so that's what we have. We have this bucket full of pieces of paper, and we want to make payments possible, right? So you want to pay one of your friends. And what does it mean to have paid one of my friends? It means I have added a UTXO to the bucket that belongs to them and has whatever asset it is that I need to pay them. Okay, so if I owe my friend 1 ETH, then one way of paying that to them would be to create a UTXO in this bucket that belongs to them and is worth 1 ETH. So that's our goal, is to be able to create new UTXOs that have our friend as the owner and have whatever we owe them as the asset, right? Now, the way that we do that is we just walk up to the bucket with this encrypted UTXO, and we put it in the bucket. But before putting it in, we have to submit a proof to the blockchain, right? And so this is where the ZK SNARKs come in. So we come up with a ZK SNARK that can prove the following statement, okay? It's these 4 bullet points that I have here. Think of these as one statement, right? So what you prove is I own one of the UTXOs in this bucket. I have not spent that UTXO yet. That UTXO has the same value as the new one I'm creating. And finally, I created it according to a certain set of rules. So those statements together form one statement, and using some of the complicated math that I showed at the very beginning of this presentation, we have protocols that allow you to come up with proofs of that statement. I've simplified the statement, obviously, right? The statement has to be made in a much mathier way in order to come up with a proof of it. But basically, it's this statement that we come up with a proof of. And when you go to put a UTXO into the bucket to pay your friend, what you also have to do is give the proof to the Manta Network blockchain. And the blockchain, the ledger, is going to verify your proof. And they're only going to accept the UTXO if that proof passes, right? So if your proof was valid, then you get to put a UTXO in the bucket. That UTXO has your friend's name on it and has some asset to it, right? And now your friend is the owner of a UTXO in the bucket that they have not spent yet. And so they themselves now have what they need to someday pay their friend using that UTXO, right? So they can create one of these proofs later, right? And this is how payments occur, is by people creating UTXOs, submitting proofs that the people creating transactions, submitting proof that that transaction is valid, and then putting UTXOs in the bucket, okay? That's a really rough sketch of how it works. And the thing that I want to highlight is the way that privacy ends up being preserved in all of that, because you have to look very carefully at the wording that I used. The first part of this statement is, I own one of the UTXOs in this bucket. And it's that one of that is so important, okay? Because in your proof, just as the Rubik's Cube tutor did not want to show me any of the secrets to how they solve the cube, okay? In this proof, I don't want to show the verifier which UTXO belongs to me. If I were to show them which UTXO I'm spending, then they could look and see which transaction that UTXO originated from. And then they would have a way of linking me to that previous transaction, and I would lose some of my privacy, right? So the very clever thing is that we don't say which UTXO we own. We just prove that we own one of the UTXOs that's in the bucket, okay? Now, you also have to prove that you haven't spent it already. That's for sort of obvious reasons, because otherwise people would what we call double spend, right? When they received a payment from their friend, they would send that same payment to 2 friends and create value out of thin air. So it's obviously important that they prove to us that they have not already spent the UTXO. Related to that, right, related to not creating value out of nowhere, is that you have to also prove that the UTXO's values match up, right? So that you are not creating value that you didn't already have, right? And then the last point about creating it according to certain rules, there you're basically just proving that you followed the protocol's encryption scheme, because like I said, these are not, these UTXOs are encrypted, and this is getting a bit technical, but you need to prove that you did the encryption honestly to ensure that the UTXO will be spendable down the line, right? So if we do things this way, then privacy is preserved. I'll just remind you that what actually shows up, right, on chain is proofs that transactions are valid, and not private details about those transactions, right? And so that is how ZK SNARKs get used at Manta Network to create private payment. That was a lot of information in a short time. I hope that some of it was enlightening. And like I said, I'll stick around for a little while to answer questions that you might have. So thanks for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much, Todd. Really appreciate it. I think that this was a great conversation around simplifying very complex ideas. Thanks for going through all that with us. And I see that there's not really any questions in the audience, so I assume that everything's pretty clear. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully this was educational, and we will speak to you guys next Wednesday. All right. Thank you.
Great. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.